Hey folks, and welcome to iWizard. So this is a special project. I just finished teaching John Milton's epic masterpiece, Paradise Lost. This work is considered by many to be one of the greatest works, if not the greatest work of English literature ever written. So I thought I would do an ultimate beginner's guide for you guys, and it'll be split into three parts. So this first episode, I'll take you through the beginning, the first two books, and then in the second video, we'll do books 3 through 9, and the third video, we'll do 10 through 12. And my goal here is to give you a full rundown of the story. We'll talk about the characters, especially Milton Satan, which is one of the most fascinating creations in all of literature. But most importantly, I'm going to get into why I think Paradise Lost matters for us today, what it has to say about good, evil, and human nature, and why I think you could easily view this book as fantasy literature. So stay tuned. All right, welcome back. Jordan here. So Paradise Lost is the 17th century poet John Milton's attempt to give the Christian world its own epic worthy of Homer and Virgil. And to do this, he basically infuses the Bible with the myths of ancient Greece and Rome and produces a masterwork of the Western imagination. The result here is a 12-book, nearly 400-page-long poem set in blank verse, and that's what we're going to talk about today. Interestingly enough, by this time in his life, Milton had gone completely blind, and so to complete this work, he actually had to dictate it aloud to scribes, including his daughters, so that he could get it down on the page. So the first edition of Paradise Lost was published in 10 books in 1667, while the 12-book volume that we typically read today was published in 1674 with some changes. Anyhow, let's get into what this book is about, and I'm going to start with a very robust summary of the general plot so that you get a sense of the story, and I'll try to make it interesting, and then we'll get into some of the big ideas. Just a note, these are not going to be spoiler-free videos, so just beware of that. There will be spoilers because this isn't just a vague review. This is a full guide to Paradise Lost. So if you're studying this book for school or just for your own enjoyment or edification, this video should make for a nice companion or supplement. So Paradise Lost presents two main story arcs. One is about the fall of the archangel Lucifer from heaven and his subsequent arc as the devil Satan, and the other tells the story of Adam and Eve and the Garden of Eden and their ultimate expulsion from paradise. So we start at the beginning with book 1, the archangel Lucifer, who was formerly like one of the most powerful beings in heaven. He's been banished from heaven for leading a rebellion against God. And not just any rebellion, he gathered about a third of the population of heaven, angels, seraphim, cherubim, and turned them all against God, and then led an epic war against him before losing that war and essentially being chased out of heaven. But Paradise Lost actually begins the way that most traditional epics do, in medias res, which means in the middle of its subject matter. So the war against God, that's kind of the backstory. And so for us, the story actually begins in hell with Satan, titanic in form, lying on his back, angry and miserable, chained to a lake of fire with his host of rebel angels. Milton tells us that Satan was, quote, hurled headlong, flaming from the ethereal sky with hideous combustion down to the bottomless perdition, there to dwell in adamantine chains and penal fire. So when we first meet Satan, he has just woken up in hell, and he's gazing around with baleful eyes Milton tells us, of obdurate pride and steadfast hate, and he's taking in his surroundings, which Milton describes as waste and wild, a dungeon horrible all sides round, as one great furnace flamed, yet from those flames no light, but rather darkness visible, a place where you'll discover only quote, sights of woe, regions of sorrow, doleful shades where peace and rest can never dwell, where hope never comes, only torture without end. This is the new reality that Lucifer, now known as Satan, wakes up to. But he's not alone, quote, there the companions of his fall, overwhelmed with floods and whirlwinds of tempestuous fire, weltering by his side, one next himself in power and next in crime, Beelzebub. So here we learn that Satan's obsequious mouthpiece and his second in command is none other than the Lord of the Flies, Beelzebub himself. And this is where we get Satan's infamous first words. And here Satan is looking at Beelzebub and just marveling at how much he's changed. He says, if thou beest he, but oh, how fallen, how changed from him who, in the happy realms of life, clothed with transcendent brightness, didst outshine myriads. So what Satan's saying is, if that's really you, and you look like that, what does that mean for me? And so what he's remarking on is how they didn't just fall from heaven. They didn't just fall from grace. The fall has changed them. It's changed them spiritually, but it's also changed their appearances. There's no more luster. They're tarnished. Still, Satan says, and this has become one of the most oft-cited lines in English literature, he says, better to reign in hell than to serve in heaven. And that's such a famous line there, because it really does tell you everything that you need to know about Satan's character. And we'll get back to that. But basically, Satan decides he's going to be the alpha down there. And so he frees himself from his chains, escapes the lake of fire, and then he flies to a barren plain, because remember, he has wings. And with Beelzebub by his side, he calls the other fallen angels to join him. And so as they come, this is where we get a cataloging of the other fallen angels. And Milton kind of describes them one by one. Now, obviously, this is meant to evoke the cataloging of ships from Homer's Iliad, but it's also a way for Milton to kind of build out his unique sort of religious cosmology. And what's cool is that Milton gives everyone in hell a new name based on the traits that they now have after falling from heaven. And each name represents like a vice or a destructive force. And what he does is he names them after the beings that the heathens, quote, adore for deities. They were named, Milton says, quote, according to the idols known afterwards in Canaan and the countries adjoining. So these weren't their original heavenly names, but this way Milton can kind of portray their evil using familiar symbolism. And so you've probably heard of most of these names. For example, there's Moloch, the idolatrous deity who was worshipped by some of the Israelites. And the chief feature of his cult, of course, was child sacrifice. There's Lucifer, who seems to have been derived from Hephaestus from Greek mythology. So when Satan decides to build a capital city for hell, Lucifer ends up being the chief architect. There's Beelzebub, as I mentioned before, and again, he's the demon, according to Milton's mythology, who drove flies away from sacrifices, and he acts as Satan's mouthpiece in this. There's Mammon. So in the Bible, Mammon is presented as like the demon personification of wealth. Milton calls him the least erected of the fallen angels because he always has his eyes downcast looking for gold or money of some kind. We have Belial, whose name means wickedness or destruction. But for Milton, he's the demon really of impurity and lazy, quote, ignoble ease. There's Rimmon and Chemos and Ashtaroth and plenty of other evil names, but I just wanted to give you a flavor of that before we move on. So Milton writes, all these and more came flocking, but with looks downcast and damp, as they trod their, quote, painful steps over the burnt soil. And now they stand, Milton writes, a horrid front of dreadful length and dazzling arms and guise of warriors old, with ordered spear and shield, awaiting what command their mighty chief had to impose. And so they're down there, and yes, they've been defeated. A full third of heaven has been cast out and banished to hell, and Milton tells us there's millions of them down there that have been banished. At this point, the warlike trumpets begin to blow, quote, sonorous metal blowing martial sounds, at which the universal host upsent a shout that tore hell's concave, and beyond frighted the reign of chaos and old night, and through the gloom were seen 10,000 banners rising into the air, and with them rose a forest huge of spears and thronging helm and interlinked shields moving in perfect phalanx. So I want you to picture this scene. You have thousands upon thousands, millions, if what Milton says is true, of fallen angels and cherubs and seraphim armed in this massive cavernous hell chamber with the lake of fire and these smoldering mountains of doom. And then you have Satan standing over all of them, looking over them, the emperor of hell, the, quote, dread commander, he above the rest in shape and gesture, proudly eminent, stood like a tower, deep scars of thunder entrenched on his face, under brows of dauntless courage and considerate pride, waiting revenge. Cruel his eye, but cast signs of remorse and passion to behold the fellows of his crime. So you get the picture. There's an army of hell demons down there, and it's at this point that Satan speaks, and he gives them hope. Who can yet believe, he says, though after loss, that all these puissant, these powerful legions, these puissant legions whose exile hath emptied heaven, shall fail to reascend, self-raised, and repossess their native seat. He goes on to explain that God, who reigns as monarch in heaven, he sits on his throne in regal state, quote, upheld by old repute, by consent and custom, but with his strength concealed, which tempted our attempt and wrought our fall. So Satan basically says, we tried to overthrow God, but we had no idea how powerful he was going to be. We underestimated him. It turns out, Satan says, this isn't a guy that you can just go to war with, force against force. We done messed up. But there's another way. Quote, our better part remains to work in close design, by fraud or guile what force affected not. So we're going to use cunning and trickery. We're going to undermine God this time by outsmarting him, since he's too powerful to be beaten by force. And now Satan really gets to the point. He says, there's a rumor about God. I have it on good information. I have a source in heaven who tells me that, quote, space may produce new worlds that he ere long intends to create, and therein plant a generation whom his choice regard should favor equal to the sons of heaven. So God is going to create these new beings, human beings, to love and preside over. And so Satan says, this is how we're going to undermine God. This is how we're going to get him. He's clearly replacing us, and we're not going to stand for that. For this infernal pit shall never hold celestial spirits in bondage. War then, war open or understood, must be resolved. And at this, quote, to confirm his words, out flew millions of flaming swords. The sudden blaze far round illumined hell. Highly they raged against the highest, and fierce with grasped arms clashed on their sounding shields the din of war, hurling defiance toward the vault of heaven. All right, so this jazzes everyone up, and with Mammon taking the lead, they all go off to find mineral resources in the mountains of hell and immediately begin working on a capital city for hell, and they decide to call it Pandemonium, literally pan-demon all demon place. This is a word actually that Milton invented for this story, and I just love Milton's descriptions as they go about building a pandemonium. Very much reminds me of the orcs in Lord of the Rings working at the behest of Saruman. Here's a little taste. There stood a hill not far, whose grisly top belched fire and rolling smoke. The rest entire shone with a glassy scurf, undoubted sign that in his womb was hid metallic ore. Thither winged with speed, a numerous brigade hastened, as when bands of pioneers with spade and pickaxe armed forerun the royal camp to trench a field or cast a rampart. And so with the expertise of Lucifer, who is the architect and builder, and with the devil army flying this way and that, Milton compares them to a great swarm of bees. They get the city underway, and most importantly, they construct the massive tower that's going to serve as Pandemonium's great fortress. And so when the work's done and the city is completed, this fortress ends up being where they all assemble for the first great council, presided over by none other than Satan himself. And so I'll take you into book 2 because I really feel like book 2 very nicely sets up the rest of the story. And it's actually one of my favorite scenes in the whole book. And it is called The Great Consult. And this is essentially an intense strategy session / council meeting. And the whole motley crew is there, high up in this tower, with Satan above them all on his, quote, throne of royal state, by merit raised to that bad eminence, insatiate to pursue vain war with heaven. And so the whole thing begins with a speech from Satan. Powers and dominions, deities of heaven, Satan says, from this descent, celestial virtues rising will appear more glorious and more dread than from no fall. So basically he's saying, in some ways, the fact that we've fallen is a good thing because that'll make our rise to power, that'll make it appear that much greater. Everyone loves a comeback story. Everyone roots for the underdog. And so he ends his speech by saying, we now return to claim our just inheritance of old, and by what best way, whether of open war or covert guile, we now debate. Who can advise may speak. So Satan opens it up for debate, and we can see here that what we're getting is a certain type of ruler, very Machiavellian, someone who wants to let his advisors fight for their positions, and then Satan will take it all in and make his own decision. So the debate starts with Moloch, who is described earlier as a horrid king besmeared with blood of human sacrifice and parents' tears, though through the noise of drums and timbrels loud their children's cries, unheard, that pass through fire to his grim idol. So that is quite the image we get there of him. But Moloch argues, he says, my sentence is for open war. He says, look, cunning is not my strength. While the cunning people sit there plotting and contriving, we're down here, heaven's fugitives, languishing in hell. He says, let's use the anger that we have against God. He reigns by our delay. Moloch says, let's go up there, quote, armed with hell flames and fury, all at once over heaven's high towers, and force our war, turning our tortures into horrid arms against the torturer, when to meet the noise of his almighty engine he shall hear infernal thunder, and for lightning see black fire and horror shot with equal rage among his angels. So he ends by saying, listen, what can be worse than to dwell here, driven out from bliss, condemned in this abhorred deep to utter woe? So Moloch isn't subtle or sophisticated, as you can see. He makes it clear that he wants nothing less than total war against God. And so next up is Belial. It's his turn. In act more graceful and humane, for dignity composed, but always false and hollow, Milton tells us. So remember, Belial is the demon of ignoble ease and laziness, yet he, quote, pleased the ear and argued with persuasive accents. Belial says, listen, I'd agree to open war, as I hate God just as much as you guys do, but that's precisely why we shouldn't do this. Our very hatred and anger and resentment makes our chances remote. Not to mention, Belial says, God camps his armies out around the edges of this pit of hell. He sends his legions out to prowl around at night and scout us. If we go to war with God again, he'll crush us even worse. Look, he says, I get it. It'd be one thing if he would grant us death. That would be an end to our suffering. But he won't. What if the same God who lit these great fires were to make them 7 times greater and throw us back down here into the flames after he defeats us? Okay, so what we should really do, Belial says, is just chill down here. Maybe in time, God's anger will cool down, and once he feels he's punished us enough, he'll ease off. And besides, over time, this horror will grow mild, he says, and this darkness light. So he's basically saying, Eventually, God will stop being so angry, and in the meantime, we'll adjust to this punishment, and we may actually be able to survive down here and maybe even get comfortable. So this is where Mammon comes in. Remember, Milton tells us that Mammon is, quote, the least erected spirit that fell from heaven, for even in heaven his looks and thoughts were always downward bent, admiring more the riches of heaven's pavement of gold than aught divine or holy else. So Mammon says, there's really no place for us in heaven. Let's face it, God's too powerful. We're not going to beat him. The best we can hope is that he forgives us in time, at which point, yeah, we'll get to return to heaven, but we'll just have to bow down before him and be his subjects once again. How could we face having to stand humble before him, obeying his strict laws, celebrating his power, singing hymns to his godly magnificence? Quote, forced hallelujahs while he lordly sits our envied sovereign. No, we're not going to worship someone we hate. So let's not try and get by force that which is impossible, or by permission that which would be utterly intolerable. We may be stuck in this place, but think about it, Mammon says. We're free. Let's, quote, see ourselves good from ourselves, and from our own live to ourselves, free and to none accountable, preferring hard liberty before the easy yoke of servile pomp. So Mammon here, though he's likely only pretending to be a lover of liberty, for him, remember, it's usually just about gold in the end. Nevertheless, he is arguing for uncomfortable freedom over comfortable slavery. Moreover, he says, if God can imitate our darkness with all his rage and punishment, why can't we imitate his light? This molten desert soil isn't lacking in gold, gems, and hidden treasures, nor are we lacking the skill to build our own empire down here, he says. We can raise our own magnificence. And besides, he goes on, living here, it'll toughen us up. It may not be great down here now, but pretty soon we won't even notice it. Quote, our torments also may in length of time become our elements. These piercing fires, as soft as now severe, our temper changed. So this is a great speech. Everyone gets carried away by Mammon's slick words. They start clapping. And at this point, Beelzebub, the mouthpiece and second in command to Satan, he claps back at Mammon and ridicules his ideas. Firstly, he says, Mammon's idea of developing hell and turning it into some magnificent realm, that's wrong. By birth, we belong in heaven. Must we renounce our ethereal titles now, he asks? Quote, must we, changing style, be called princes of hell? What a downgrade that is basically what Beelzebub's saying. How silly you guys for going along with Mammon's plan, pretending like this place is some dream. Whereas you guys all know that the King of Heaven designed this place to be a literal prison. You guys act like this place is some safe haven, right? Some alternate realm out of the reach of God's power, and that we're like establishing our own sovereign empire and building a new alliance against heaven, as if heaven is just some other sovereign nation that we can just compete with, right, on our own terms. But that's wrong. We are literally God's prisoners. We have been banished to a place that is part of God's kingdom. He's the ruler, Beelzebub says, and he's not going to lose part of his kingdom and just let us establish some autonomous zone, Chaz, right? What he's going to do is he's going to keep us in prison and, quote, with iron scepter rule us here while we sit, quote, projecting peace and war. Neither peace nor open war will work, Beelzebub says, but, and here's where he revisits the rumor that Satan hinted at in his opening speech. He says, quote, what if we find some easier enterprise? There is a place, if ancient and prophetic fame in heaven err not, another world, the happy seat of some new race called man, about this time to be created, like to us, though less in power and excellence, but favored more of him who rules above. Thither let us bend our thoughts to learn what creatures there inhabit, of what mold or substance, how endued and what their power, and where their weakness, how attempted best, by force or subtlety. Though heaven be shut, and heaven's high arbiter sit secure in his own strength, this place may lie exposed, the utmost border of his kingdom left to their defense who hold it. So what we need to do, basically, Beelzebub says, is, look, we can't beat God by force. We tried that. But since he's creating this new world that lies between heaven and hell, and he's creating these new creatures, mankind, let's sneak into that zone, study these new creatures so that we can understand their weaknesses and what they're made of. And then he goes on to present two distinct courses of action. Quote, "Here perhaps some advantageous act may be achieved by sudden onset, either with hellfire to waste his whole creation, or possess all as our own, and drive as we were driven these puny habitants, or, if not drive, seduce them to our party, that their God may prove their foe, and with repenting hand abolish his own works. When his darling sons, hurled headlong to partake with us, shall curse their frail original and faded bliss." So basically, Beelzebub is like, we can get back at God by A, capturing his precious humans, bringing them down to hell with us, and then killing them. That'd be great and pretty easy. Or even better, we can B, see if they'll join us willingly. And then in that case, we can bring them down here, turn them against God, and get them to the point where they basically want to become immortal demons like us, cursing their old, puny, frail human forms, at which point we can get God to slaughter his precious humans. Wouldn't this be the best revenge? Isn't this the best way to get back at God? And so this is where Satan steps in and ends the debate. "Well have ye judged," Satan says, "well ended long debate, great things resolved, which from the lowest deep will once more lift us up in spite of fate nearer our ancient seat. But first," Satan says, "whom shall we send in search of this new world? Whom shall we find sufficient? Who shall tempt with wandering feet the dark, unbuttoned, infinite abyss, and through the palpable obscure find out this uncouth way? Or spread his airy flight, upborne with indefatigable wings, over the vast abrupt ere he arrive the happy isle?" And then Satan pauses and looks around, quote, "his look suspense, awaiting who appeared to second or oppose, or undertake the perilous attempt. But all sat mute, pondering the danger with deep thoughts, and each in each other's countenance read his own dismay. None among the choice and prime of those heaven-warring champions could be found so hardy as to proffer or accept alone the dreadful voyage, till at last Satan, with monarchical pride, thus spake." And so Satan says, look, I get why no one is volunteering to undertake this voyage. Long is the way and hard, he says. Whoever accepts this mission will have to first escape from this prison we're in, which by itself is next to impossible. This huge convex of fire, Satan says, outrageous to devour, immures us round ninefold, and gates of burning adamant barred over us prohibit all egress. So we're in a great bowl of fire, wrapped around us 9 times. The gates are barred above us to prevent our exit. So whoever goes, once he gets past that, if he gets past that, the quote, void profound of unessential night receives him next. Wide gaping and with utter loss of being, threatens him plunged into that abortive gulf. And so if you do make it through the gates, and then you even make it through the void of chaos and nothingness, if thence escape into whatever world or unknown region, Satan says, what remains him less than unknown dangers? So even if you get through the realm of chaos, you don't even know if you're going to land in the right world that you're trying to get to. Then and only then, if you do make it, here's a question. How are you going to sneak past the angels and all the guardians that God has set in place? And how are you going to sneak into this new world that God has created? Plus, remember, God sees everything. So it's not like you're just going to go undetected. And then even if you do get there, even if you get to that world, defying all odds, that is then where the real work begins. You have to have a plan. You have to study God's newest creation, man, and figure out the best course of action. And because of that, Satan declares, I'm going to have to do it. I will step up and accept this most urgent mission. Quote, I should ill become this throne, O peers, and this imperial sovereignty, adorned with splendor, armed with power, Satan says, if aught proposed and judged of public moment in the shape of difficulty or danger could deter me from attempting. Wherefore do I assume these royalties, refusing to accept as great a share of hazard as honor due alike? And so Satan essentially says, how could I accept this power you've given me and these kingly privileges and then refuse to be a king? It's my responsibility to accept as large a share of danger as I've been given of honor. So having decided to go, Satan says, listen, guys, while I'm gone, I know it kind of sucks down here, but see if you can spruce the place up a bit. Quote, intend at home, while here shall be our home, what best may ease the present misery and render hell more tolerable. If there be cure or charm to respite or deceive or slack the pain of this ill mansion. So I love that Satan is basically like, while I'm gone, please clean up the house. And then I also love how this whole debate, how this meeting closes, because Milton just spares nothing. He never phones it in. Every line is so packed with vivid turns of phrase and evocative description. The Stygian council thus dissolved, Milton writes. Forth in order came the grand infernal peers. Midst came their mighty paramount, and seemed alone the antagonist of heaven, nor less than hell's dread emperor, with pomp supreme and godlike imitated state. So already you can see that Satan, even in his fallen state, is imitating the rank of God. Then of their session ended, they bid cry with trumpets regal, sound the great result. Toward the four winds, four speedy cherubim put to their mouths the sounding alchemy. So the cherubim face each compass point and blow their golden trumpets in all directions. Quote, heard far and wide, and all the host of hell with deafening shout returned them loud acclaim. And so as the great emperor Satan leaves for his journey, the host of hell, and this is kind of a neat little touch here, they all go off in their own direction. Some of them fly around. Some of them hold competitive races and games. Quote, in swift race contend as at the Olympian games or Pythian fields, swerving their fiery horse-drawn chariots around. So I want you to imagine the imagery here that Milton is painting. The fiery horses of hell pulling fallen angels around as cherubim and seraphim fly overhead like some fresco painting in hell. Some go off and explore hell like pioneers, quote, on bold adventure to discover wide that dismal world, if any clime perhaps might yield them habitation, bend four ways their flying march along the banks of four infernal rivers that disengorge into the lake their baleful streams. So they go off and explore the river Styx, the river Acheron, the river Cocytus, the fierce river Phlegethon, whose waves of torrent fire and flame with rage. And then they go off and observe and explore the silent stream Lethe. The river of oblivion rolls her watery labyrinth, whereof who drinks forthwith, etc., etc. And so thus roving on through many a dark and dreary vale they passed, and many a region dolorous, over many a frozen, many a fiery alp, rocks, caves, lakes, fens, bogs, dens, and shades of death, a universe of death. Okay, so they're exploring hell. They're trying to figure out, are there better places to set up camp? Are there places that we can get better raw materials and resources? All right, meanwhile, Satan, quote, the adversary of God and man, with thoughts inflamed of highest design, puts on swift wings and toward the gates of hell explores his solitary flight. So he's going on his journey, and when he gets to the border of hell, the gates themselves are huge, quote, reaching up to the horrid roof, and there were 9 in total. 3 of them were brass, 3 were iron, and 3 were adamantine rock, impenetrable, impaled with circling fire. And so in one of the most famous scenes in all of literature, Satan approaches, and there's a, quote, formidable shape on either side guarding the gates. On the one side, you have what looks to be a beautiful woman to the waist, but from the waist down, it is all serpent coils. Quote, many a scaly fold, voluminous and vast, a serpent armed with mortal sting. Around her middle, a pack of hellhounds barked, quote, with wide Cerberian mouths. So basically, Cerberus was, in Greek mythology, the hound of Hades that guarded the gates of hell. So these dogs also have 3 heads, and they bark, and they use this female creature's womb as a kennel. But they're also meant to evoke Scylla from Ovid's Metamorphoses. In fact, Milton says that these dogs are way worse than the ones who, quote, vexed Scylla, bathing in the sea that parts Calabria from the hoarse Trinacrian shore, nor uglier follow the night hag. When called in secret, riding through the air, she comes, lured with the smell of infant blood, to dance with Lapland witches, while the laboring moon eclipses at their charms. So just some incredibly vivid imagery laced with allusions from Greek mythology. So she's on one side of the gate. On the opposite, the other shape, Milton writes, if shape it might be called, that shape had none distinguishable in member, joint, or limb. So whatever this thing is on the other side of the gate, it's formless almost. It could have been called substance or shadow, Milton says. Black it stood as night, fierce as 10 furies, terrible as hell, and shook a dreadful dart. And it had a weird-looking crown on its head. So this thing gets up, quote, the monster moving onward came as fast with horrid strides. Hell trembled as he strode. And so this monstrous thing charges at Satan, but Satan takes the offense and basically says, first of all, what the hell are you, execrable shape, he calls him, and who are you to, quote, advance thy miscreated front athwart my way? I'm going through these gates, hellborn, Satan says, so don't mess with me, or you can, quote, taste thy folly. To whom the goblin, full of wrath, replied, and so this is the monster, art thou that traitor angel? Art thou he who first broke peace in heaven, and faith till then unbroken, and in proud rebellious arms drew after him the third part of heaven's sons, conjured against the highest, for which both thou and they, outcast from God, are here condemned to waste eternal days in woe and pain? And reckonest thou thyself with spirits of heaven, hell-doomed, and breathest defiance here and scorn where I reign king? And to enrage thee more, thy king and lord? Back to thy punishment, false fugitive, and to thy speed add wings, lest with a whip of scorpions I pursue thy lingering, or with one stroke of this dart strange horror seize thee, and pangs unfelt before. So spake the grisly terror, and in shape so speaking and so threatening grew tenfold more dreadful and deformed. So this thing's not budging, and it's not going well for Satan. So basically, Satan and death square up. And yes, we learn that this creature's name is death. And so here they are, face to face, like staring each other down. Each at the head leveled his deadly aim, as Milton puts it. Their fatal hands no second stroke intend, and such a frown each cast at the other. And this is when the third creature steps in. The, quote, snaky sorceress that sat fast by Hellgate and kept the fatal key. She jumps between them to break up this fight. And what she says, like, totally rocks Satan's world. She gets up, she gets between them. "O Father," she cries, "what intends thy hand? Against thy only son? And what fury, O son, possesses thee to bend that mortal dart against thy father's head?" And so Satan's like, what? You just yelled at me for raising my hand against my son? And then hold up, you just yelled at him just now, calling him, "O son." Like, am I missing something? And so at this point, the mysterious snake woman, portress of Hellgate, Milton calls her, this is obviously a Macbeth reference, she says, quote, "Hast thou forgotten me then? And do I seem now in thine eye so foul, once deemed so fair in heaven?" So another Macbeth reference, obviously. And she proceeds to remind him of who she is. She says, "Do you remember how you plotted with your minions to overthrow God in heaven? Well, one day at assembly, a, quote, sudden miserable pain came over you, dimmed thine eyes and dizzy swam in darkness. And guess what?" She says, "Flames started coming out of your head, quote, thick and fast, till on the left side, opening wide, likest to thee in shape and countenance bright, then shining heavenly fair, a goddess armed out of thy head. I sprung." So she's saying, remember me, Dad? Remember how everyone at the assembly up in heaven jumped back in fear? And remember how you named me Sin? Well, here I am, Father, so the snake woman, it turns out, is Satan's daughter. And over time, Sin, as he named her, she grew up to be very pleasing and attractive. And so this is how Satan's son, Death, was born. And Milton tells us that one of the reasons Satan, or he would have been Lucifer at the time, one of the reasons he becomes so attractive to his own daughter is that he sees himself in her. Quote, "Thyself in me, thy perfect image viewing." So that kind of gives you some sense of the sort of self-worship and narcissism at the heart of Satan's personality. Sin reminds Satan how he, quote, "becamest enamored, and such joy tookest with me in secret that my womb conceived a growing burden. Meanwhile, war arose." And so once Satan was cast down to hell and lost the war, it was at that point that Sin was made the guardian of Hellgate. Quote, "pensive and alone, when, quote, at last this odious offspring whom thou seest, thine own begotten, breaking violent way, tore through my entrails, that with fear and pain distorted, all my nether shape thus grew transformed." So she is explaining, this is how I got my slithering lower half. I gave birth to this, incestuous monster. Pretty gross. And so at this point, Satan realizes, geez, I can actually use this affection that she has for me. Milton writes that he, quote, "now milder thus answered smooth." And here he thanks her for describing the, quote, "dalliance that I had with thee in heaven, and joys then sweet, now sad to mention. I come no enemy, but to set free from this dark and dismal house of pain both him and thee, myself exposed with lonely steps to tread." And so this is like peak Satan, right? He completely forgot she even existed. And then she reminds him, and he just immediately snaps to, well, that's why I came here after all, is to set you free. And then he basically uses her love to manipulate her and sweet talk her into opening the gate. She says that she's his, quote, "daughter and thy darling without end." Thus saying, from her side the fatal key, sad instrument of all our woe, she took, and toward the gate rolling her bestial train, forthwith the huge portcullis high up drew. And so she opens the gate for him. And I love the scene that follows as Satan, Sin, and Death stand there gazing out at the void of chaos once the gate is opened. Quote, "before their eyes in sudden view appear the secrets of the hoary deep, a dark, illimitable ocean without bound, without dimension, where length, breadth, and height, and time and place are lost, where eldest night and chaos," and night and chaos here, Milton is not only describing what Satan sees, but chaos and night are actually like personified forces. They are ancestors of nature, hold eternal anarchy amidst the noise of endless wars. For hot, cold, moist, and dry, four champions fierce strive here for mastery, and to battle bring their embryon atoms. They around the flag of each his faction in their several clans, light armed or heavy, sharp, smooth, swift or slow. And so Satan he kind of gulps and realizes that this journey through chaos is not going to be easy. Even though, I'll point out, Sin and Death have agreed to follow behind him as he goes and to build a bridge over chaos that runs from hell to the new world. And that way, when Satan comes back, all he has to do is walk over that bridge they built. So I'll wrap up my summary here soon. Let me just quickly get you to the end of book 2 here. So Satan spreads his wings, he jumps out into chaos, and he flies into the surging smoke, which lifts him high over the abyss. And then suddenly the smoke vanishes, and he feels himself dropping through empty space before falling 10,000 fathoms. Milton says he'd still be falling today if a fiery cloud had not tossed him up again. And so the whole thing is, not to be redundant, is absolute chaos. Now flying, now swimming, sinking and waiting and creeping. And eventually, as he's flying and using his instincts, he hears an uproar of voices ahead of him. And as he gets closer, he sees that it is Chaos sitting on his throne beside Night, his queen. And there are all these other creatures down there, Demogorgon and Tumult and Rumor and Chance and Confusion and Discord. So these are apparently all demons or spirits of the underworld, and of course, they are all aspects of chaos. So Satan addresses them, "Ye powers and spirits of this nethermost abyss," he says, "I come no spy with purpose to disturb the secrets of your realm, but by constraint, as My way lies through your spacious empire up to light, alone and without guide, half lost. I seek what readiest path leads where your gloomy bounds pass into heaven. And then he basically says, look, if you help me, I promise it won't go unrewarded. If I can bring down that new land, throw all out that grows there, return it to darkness and your rule. My aim is once again to raise the banner of night, and this will be to your advantage and my revenge. And so here he is again manipulating whoever he has to get what he wants. But, Chaos does respond positively. He says, look, I live here on my borders and I do everything I can to defend what little I have left, which is being invaded and shaken by civil wars. First, hell, your territory, took the lands far and wide beneath us. That used to be our territory. Now this new world, Earth, has been placed over my kingdom, linked by a golden chain to heaven from which your armies fell. So if that's the way you're going, you're almost there. Go ahead. And so with Chaos's permission, Satan launches himself in the direction of where he's supposed to go and, quote, wins his way, harder beset and more endangered than when Ulysses on the larboard stunned Charybdis and by the other whirlpool steered. Meanwhile, sin and death are still following behind, quote, paved after him a broad and beaten way. And so book 2 ends as Satan sees the first rays of morning light glimmering over the walls of heaven. And as he glimpses heaven's sapphire towers before him, he now sees God's newest creation, Earth, hanging by a golden chain below. Okay, so I promised I would walk you through the story. There is your lengthy, detailed summary. So before we close out here on this first episode, I want to just quickly talk about Milton's Satan for a minute. Most of Satan's best lines in Paradise Lost aren't even in these first 2 books that I summarized, so we really get to know him better later on. But still, we're introduced to him, and Milton Satan, I would say, remains one of the most enduring, one of the most fascinating, and I want to say idiosyncratic, but I really can't because he's too archetypal for that. Because Milton, and I'm not sure he even realized he was doing this, he created a character who has a very romantic, a very modern, almost Rousseauian sensibility. He captured a spirit that very much infuses and energizes our times, for better or for worse. I would argue the latter, but nevertheless, Satan's revolutionary spirit is something that is still, I would say, very much with us today. So who is Satan? I won't spoil the latter books, so let's just focus on what we know of him in the first 2 books. Satan, and I'm nowhere near the first person to point this out, you might say he's what we would call today an anti-hero, someone who serves as the protagonist of a story, and quite controversially at the time, Satan is very much the protagonist of this story, but someone who also lacks the traditional or conventional attributes that the hero of a story is supposed to have. That's an anti-hero. But it's also someone who, nevertheless, is able to elicit sympathy and a sense of almost kinship from readers. But I would go further and say that he's something more specific. Milton Satan is an intellectual. He's a smooth talker. He is a charmer and a tempter, of course. He's also highly charismatic. He's got the qualities of a leader, the leader of a rebellion or of a populist uprising. He's always making these big, articulate speeches. Satan is the guy shouting to an angry mob that the system isn't fair. He's Lenin. He's Rousseau. He's Nietzsche. He's Mephistopheles from Goethe's Faust. He's an emo teenager with a lip ring and blue hair. He's the eternal rebel against established order. He's a liberal or a leftist or maybe an anarchist or a postmodernist. It doesn't really matter as long as we recognize that he sees himself as one of the oppressed, and he decides that he doesn't need the transcendent and that what he knows is sufficient. And this is what lands him in hell. He has daddy issues. He sees God as an authoritarian, as a tyrant who reigns over an unjust order in heaven and denies people's liberties. And in fact, some have said that Satan may even represent the Enlightenment from Milton's perspective, the attempt to replace God and overthrow the religious structures that govern society. But I actually think that Milton Satan is a counter-Enlightenment figure. I think he's a romantic. I picked up a great definition of romanticism a few years back from Jonah Goldberg's book, Suicide of the West. I have my differences with Jonah. He's actually been on this channel before, but I love his definition of romanticism, and I think you can apply it to Milton Satan. The core of romanticism, Goldberg writes, is the primacy of feelings, specifically the feeling that the world we live in is not right, that it is unsatisfying and devoid of authenticity and meaning, or simply requires too much of us, and there must be an easier way. Because our feelings tell us that the world is out of balance, rigged, artificial, unfair, or most often oppressive and exploitative, our natural wiring drives us to the belief that someone must be responsible. And so that is very much the ideology of Satan. Another way you could look at it is that Satan feels like he and his band of rebels have been forced to live under what Nietzsche called the shadows of God. And he wants to get out from under those shadows. Why? Because God is telling me what to do. I don't want to follow God's plan. I want to be the author, the architect of my own moral choices. I want to be liberated from the 10 Commandments. Morality shouldn't be given. I should be able to invent it. At one point, Satan refers to himself as self-created. But Satan didn't create himself, and he knows he didn't create himself. So what does he mean? Well, for him, it means that I get to be God in hell. Better to reign in hell than to serve in heaven, as Satan himself says, probably the most famous quote from the book. It means I get to create my own commandments now. I get to erase traditional distinctions. I get to abolish all of these things that I feel are impositions on my individual autonomy. He believes he can, in Nietzschean fashion, reinvent morality, tabula rasa. He's an Ubermensch. We don't need traditional structures and norms and laws and authorities over us. We can build morality up from scratch, and we'll do so using reason. We'll derive rights from scratch using pure intellect. And the morality we'll build in hell, it'll be the opposite of God's. The mind is its own place, Satan says, and in itself can make a heaven of hell, a hell of heaven. But Satan's only moral goal, when you think about it, is a kind of reactionary negation. In book 1, when Satan is when he's first cast down into hell, he wakes up on the lake of fire and he says, quote, "What though the field be lost, all is not lost. The unconquerable will and study of revenge, immortal hate, and courage never to submit or yield." So he's going to build an empire of rebellion and resentment and vengefulness. His is a philosophy of liberation, pure and simple. Liberation from work, liberation from rules and order, liberation from having to occupy a set place in the social hierarchy, liberation from expectations and categories. No borders, no boundaries, no supreme daddy. He wants to set people free. Once they're free, what will they do next? Where will they go? Who knows? Satan certainly doesn't. But again, his philosophy begins and ends with rebellion and liberation. That's all he knows. Railing against the system, not building institutions. He's Herostratus. He'll make a name for himself by destroying rather than creating. In fact, Satan very much resembles, and I'm not the first person to point this out, the modern school shooter, the person like Mephistopheles who hates existence itself. So he decides to destroy it. Being as such is so corrupt, so suffused with suffering, that it'd be better if it never existed at all. So that's the Satan we meet at the outset of this story. And despite my obviously acerbic critique of his character, he's a wonderful character and he's a seductive character. And we'll see over the course of the next 2 episodes how he develops and how he fares in his anti-hero's journey. All right, so my voice is getting sore. Until next time, we'll do episode 2 next time. That'll be books 3 through 9. And so don't forget to hit the subscribe button. Follow us on Goodreads, Instagram, Facebook, Tip Your Starving Booktuber at Patreon. And until next time, happy reading.